My marriage counselor asked why Victoria had waited 5 years to confront her cheating husband and backstabbing best friend. The answer was simple. Revenge is a dish best served when you've had time to completely destroy their lives first. Victoria Martinez sat in the familiar beige chair across from Dr. Sarah Chen, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she delivered this revelation with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. The therapist's pen froze mid-sentence, her professional composure cracking slightly at the calculated coldness in her patient's voice. "Victoria," Dr. Chen said carefully, "when you say destroy their lives, what exactly do you mean?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time in months of sessions, it reached her eyes. "I mean that by tomorrow morning, Rachel will lose her job, her reputation, her marriage, and her financial security. Mark will lose his business, his professional license, and every asset we've built together. They thought they were so clever, sneaking around behind my back for years. They had no idea I've been 3 steps ahead of them this entire time." The story had begun 5 years earlier, on what should have been one of the happiest nights of Victoria's life. Their 8th wedding anniversary party had been perfect, or so she'd thought. 50 guests, catered dinner, champagne toasts, and her husband Mark looking handsome in the navy suit she'd bought him for the occasion. Her best friend Rachel had helped plan every detail, from the flower arrangements to the playlist. Victoria had met Rachel Chen in college during their sophomore year at Northwestern University, 2 ambitious young women studying marketing and business administration. They'd been randomly assigned as roommates in a cramped dormitory room, but their friendship had blossomed immediately. Rachel was from San Francisco, the daughter of successful tech entrepreneurs, while Victoria had grown up in a small Illinois town where her father ran a hardware store and her mother taught elementary school. Despite their different backgrounds, they'd found common ground in their shared ambitions and their determination to succeed in the competitive world of business. They studied together, supported each other through difficult classes and breakups, and spent countless nights planning their future careers over cheap takeout and even cheaper wine. Victoria remembered their junior year particularly vividly, when Rachel had been devastated by a boyfriend who'd cheated on her with another sorority girl. Victoria had spent countless hours comforting her friend, bringing her tissues and ice cream, helping her study when she could barely focus through her tears. "I just don't understand how someone could do that to someone they claim to love," Rachel had sobbed into Victoria's shoulder. "How do people live with themselves when they betray someone's trust like that?" At the time, Victoria had been touched by Rachel's apparent sensitivity and moral clarity. "Some people are just selfish," Victoria had said, stroking her friend's hair. "They only think about what they want in the moment and they don't care who gets hurt." "But you're better than that, Rach. You'd never do something like that to someone you cared about." "Never," Rachel had promised fiercely. "I could never hurt someone I loved that way. Betrayal like that is unforgivable." The irony of that conversation would become painfully clear years later. But at the time, Victoria had admired what she'd seen as Rachel's integrity and loyalty. It had been one of the moments that had cemented their friendship, making Victoria feel certain that Rachel was someone she could trust completely. After graduation, they'd both moved to Chicago, where Victoria had landed a position at Sterling & Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm specializing in digital campaigns for healthcare companies. Rachel had been hired by Morrison Creative, one of the city's most prestigious advertising agencies, working on campaigns for major national brands. They'd shared a tiny apartment in Lincoln Park, with exposed brick walls and a fire escape that served as their makeshift balcony. Those first years in Chicago had been magical. 2 young women conquering the business world during the day and exploring the city at night. They'd go to networking events together, double date with men they'd met at work, and spend lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper and planning their brilliant futures. Victoria had met Mark Thompson during her 2nd year in Chicago at a Northwestern University alumni networking event. He was a certified public accountant who'd graduated 3 years ahead of them, working for a respected firm that specialized in tax preparation and financial planning for small businesses. He'd approached her at the bar, commenting on her presentation earlier that evening about social media marketing strategies for professional services. "You made those analytics actually sound interesting," he'd said with a self-deprecating smile. "As someone who spends most of his time staring at spreadsheets, I appreciate anyone who can make numbers tell a story." Victoria had been immediately drawn to Mark's quiet confidence and dry sense of humor. Unlike the flashier men she'd been dating, Mark was steady, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her work and her ambitions. Their first date had been dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, where they'd talked for hours about their careers, their families, and their dreams for the future. Rachel had been enthusiastic about Victoria's new relationship from the beginning. "He's perfect for you," she'd declared after meeting Mark for the first time. "He's smart, he's stable, he obviously adores you, and he's got that quiet strength thing that you always go for. Plus he's cute in that Clark Kent way." Their courtship had been traditional and comfortable. Mark had sent flowers to Victoria's office, remembered important details about her projects and presentations, and had been genuinely interested in getting to know Rachel and Victoria's other friends. He'd been respectful, reliable, and romantic in all the ways that mattered. When Mark had proposed after dating for 3 years, it had been everything Victoria had dreamed of. He'd taken her to the lakefront park where they'd had their first serious conversation about the future, and had gotten down on one knee as the sun was setting over Lake Michigan. The ring had been perfect, a classic solitaire that was elegant without being ostentatious, exactly the style Victoria had always preferred. Rachel had been Victoria's maid of honor, of course. She'd helped plan every detail of the wedding, from the invitations to the seating arrangements to the honeymoon itinerary. She'd thrown Victoria a bachelorette party that had been tasteful and fun, organizing a weekend in a nearby spa town with their closest friends from college and work. The wedding had been everything Victoria had dreamed of, a beautiful ceremony at St. Michael's, the historic church where Victoria's parents had been married 30 years earlier, followed by a reception at the Drake Hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. Rachel had given a heartfelt speech about friendship and love, her voice catching with apparent emotion as she talked about the bond they shared, and her happiness at seeing Victoria find such a wonderful partner. "Victoria and I have been through everything together," Rachel had said, raising her champagne glass to the 200 assembled guests. "College stress, career changes, heartbreaks, and triumphs. I've watched her grow into an incredible woman, and I've never seen her happier than she is with Mark. They complement each other perfectly. His steadiness balances her creativity, her ambition inspires his confidence. Here's to a lifetime of love, laughter, and friendship that lasts forever." The early years of Victoria's marriage had been everything she'd hoped they would be. She and Mark had bought their first house, a charming 2-story colonial in Wilmette, a quiet suburb north of the city, and had settled into the comfortable routines of married life. The house had a spacious kitchen where they cooked together on weekends, a small home office where Mark could work from home when needed, and a guest bedroom that was always ready for friends and family. Victoria had thrived at Sterling & Associates, earning 2 promotions in her first 4 years, and becoming the youngest senior account manager in the firm's history. She'd spearheaded several major campaigns that had won industry awards, and had been featured in Marketing Today magazine as one of Chicago's rising stars under 30. Mark had left his corporate job after their 2nd anniversary to start his own accounting practice, Thompson Financial Services. He'd specialized in tax preparation and financial planning for small businesses, building a client base through referrals and community networking. His practice had grown steadily, allowing him to hire 2 junior accountants and move into a professional office building in downtown Evanston. Rachel had remained a constant presence in their lives throughout these early marriage years. She'd been their first house guest in the new home, had helped them paint the guest bedroom and plant flowers in the backyard. She'd been there to celebrate Mark's business milestones, popping champagne when he signed his office lease and bringing a congratulatory cake when he hired his first employee. When Rachel's own marriage to her college boyfriend Jake Morrison had begun to fall apart, Victoria and Mark had been her primary source of emotional support. Jake had developed a gambling addiction that had destroyed their finances and their relationship. Rachel had been devastated, not just by the betrayal but by the loss of the future she'd planned. "I feel so stupid," Rachel had confided to Victoria during one of their weekly coffee dates. All the signs were there, the mysterious absences, the money problems, the lies about where he'd been. But I trusted him completely. I believed every excuse he gave me. Victoria had held her friend's hand across the table at their favorite cafe. "You're not stupid, Rach. You're loyal. You believed in your marriage and you fought for it. That's admirable, not foolish. But how do you know when to stop fighting?" Rachel had asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do you know when someone's betrayal is too much to forgive?" "I think you know in your heart," Victoria had said gently, "when the trust is broken beyond repair, when the lies become more frequent than the truth. When you realize that you're the only one fighting for the relationship, that's when you know it's time to let go." The advice had seemed wise at the time, though Victoria would later reflect on the irony of counseling her future betrayer about the nature of trust and forgiveness. When Rachel's divorce was finalized after a messy 6-month process, she'd been left with almost nothing. Jake had gambled away their savings, defaulted on their mortgage, and even pawned Rachel's grandmother's jewelry to fund his addiction. Rachel had been forced to start over completely, moving back in with her parents in San Francisco while she figured out her next steps. "She can stay with us for as long as she needs," Victoria had told Mark when Rachel had called in tears, explaining her situation. "She's been there for us through everything. It's the least we can do." Of course, Mark had agreed immediately. "She's family. We'll set up the guest room properly, and she can take all the time she needs to get back on her feet." Rachel had lived with them for 6 months, during which time Victoria had watched her friends slowly rebuild her confidence and her life. Rachel had thrown herself into her career at Morrison Creative, working late nights and weekends to establish herself as one of their most reliable account managers. She'd been determined to prove that she could succeed on her own, without depending on anyone else for her security or happiness. During those months, Victoria had been proud of how supportive Mark had been. He'd helped Rachel with her financial planning, teaching her about budgeting and savings accounts and retirement planning, all the things that Jake's irresponsibility had made her anxious about. He'd fixed her car when it broke down, had been there to move heavy furniture when she'd finally found her own apartment, and had generally been the kind of reliable, trustworthy man that Victoria had always known him to be. Looking back, Victoria realized this had been when the dynamic began to shift, though she'd been too trusting to recognize the warning signs. Rachel would linger in the kitchen when Mark came home from work, engaging him in conversations about her day while Victoria finished dinner preparations. She developed inside jokes with Mark, references to conversations they'd had during Victoria's long days at the office. She'd started asking Mark for advice about financial matters, car problems, and other issues that gave them reasons to spend time together. Victoria had dismissed these observations as paranoia. Rachel was her best friend, practically a sister. Mark was her devoted husband, who'd never given her reason to doubt his loyalty. The idea that they might betray her trust was not just unthinkable, it seemed to contradict everything she knew about their characters. Even when Rachel had moved out and into her own apartment, a charming one-bedroom in Lincoln Park that Mark had helped her find and negotiate the lease for, the pattern had continued and intensified. Rachel would call Mark for advice about investments, ask him to help her with her taxes, or request his assistance with various household repairs and problems. "I don't know what I'd do without Mark's help," Rachel had told Victoria gratefully after Mark had spent an entire Saturday helping her assemble furniture and hang pictures in her new apartment. "He's like the brother I never had. You're so lucky to have someone so generous and reliable." Victoria had appreciated how well her husband and best friend got along, seeing it as evidence of the solid foundation of her marriage and friendships. She'd felt blessed to have two people she loved so much, who also genuinely liked and respected each other. The night of their 8th anniversary party had shattered all of Victoria's naive assumptions about the people she trusted most. She'd spent weeks planning the celebration, wanting everything to be perfect for their milestone anniversary. 50 guests had been invited, family members, close friends, colleagues from both of their careers. She'd hired caterers, rented elegant serving pieces, and had even splurged on a string quartet to provide background music during dinner. Victoria had worn a new navy blue dress that she'd found at a boutique in downtown Chicago, silk with delicate beading around the neckline that caught the light beautifully. Mark had looked handsome in the navy suit she'd bought him for the occasion, and she'd felt radiant as friends and family congratulated them on their strong, enduring marriage. Rachel had been the perfect co-hostess, arriving early to help Victoria with last-minute preparations and staying late to help with cleanup. She'd coordinated with the caterers, ensured that glasses stayed full throughout the evening, and had made sure every guest felt welcome and included in the celebration. The evening had been filled with heartfelt toasts and warm reminiscences about Victoria and Mark's relationship. Victoria's father had spoken about how proud he was of the woman his daughter had become, and how grateful he was that she'd found such a good man to share her life with. Mark's business partner had toasted Mark's integrity and work ethic, noting how his personal character was reflected in his professional success. Rachel had given the most touching speech of the evening, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded living room as she talked about the enduring power of love and friendship. 8 years ago, I had the privilege of standing beside Victoria as she married the love of her life, she'd said, her voice catching with apparent emotion. I've watched their marriage grow stronger with each passing year, weathering challenges and celebrating victories together. They've shown all of us what it means to be truly committed to another person, to choose love not just once but every single day. They're an inspiration to all of us, proof that true love really does exist, and that it gets better with time, deeper with understanding, and stronger with trust. The guests had applauded enthusiastically, and Victoria had hugged Rachel gratefully, touched by her friend's beautiful words and the obvious emotion behind them. Mark had kissed Victoria's cheek and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive to be married to such an amazing woman and to have such wonderful friends in their lives. Around 10 o'clock, as the evening was winding down and some of the older guests were beginning to leave, Victoria had been in the kitchen organizing the dessert service when she'd noticed that both Mark and Rachel were missing from the main party area. She'd assumed Mark was probably in his home office, showing some of the guests his professional certifications and awards. He was always proud to display his accomplishments and loved talking about his business with other entrepreneurs. Rachel, she'd figured, was probably in the powder room or perhaps outside on the back patio getting some fresh air. The evening had been warm, and the house had gotten a bit stuffy with so many people gathered in the main living areas. It was their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd inadvertently planted the first seed of suspicion. Mrs. Henderson was a sweet woman in her 70s, who lived next door and had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Victoria and Mark since they'd moved to the neighborhood. Victoria had invited her to the party partly out of politeness and partly out of genuine affection for the kind woman who'd welcomed them so warmly to the community. "Your friend Rachel is such a lovely girl," Mrs. Henderson had whispered to Victoria as they stood near the dining room buffet, where the dessert table had been beautifully arranged with a variety of cakes, pastries, and fresh fruit. "Though I did notice her going upstairs with Mark earlier. I hope she's feeling all right. She looked a bit flushed when I saw them heading toward the stairs together." Victoria's heart had stuttered at the casual observation, though she'd managed to keep her expression neutral and conversational. "Upstairs?" she'd managed to ask, her voice sounding surprisingly normal despite the sudden tightness in her throat. "Yes, dear. About 20 minutes ago, maybe a bit more," Mrs. Henderson had continued, completely oblivious to the impact of her words. "I was just coming out of the powder room when I saw them at the bottom of the stairs." Mark had his hand on Rachel's back, guiding her up. "I assumed she might not be feeling well, and your husband was showing her to a quiet room where she could rest or perhaps lie down for a few minutes." Mrs. Henderson had then moved on to compliment the catering and ask about the recipe for the salmon canapes, but Victoria had remained frozen by the dining room table, her mind racing through possible innocent explanations for what Mrs. Henderson had observed. Mark could have been showing Rachel something in his home office, which was on the second floor of their house. Or perhaps Rachel had needed a quiet space to take an important phone call. Victoria knew that Rachel had been dealing with some complicated issues at work lately. Or maybe Rachel had asked to borrow something from Victoria's bedroom, or had needed to use the upstairs bathroom because the main floor powder room had been occupied. But even as Victoria tried to rationalize the situation and convince herself there were perfectly innocent explanations, a cold dread was settling in her stomach like a stone. Something about Mrs. Henderson's description, Mark's hand on Rachel's back, the fact that they'd been gone for over 20 minutes, Rachel's apparently flushed appearance, felt wrong in a way that Victoria couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore. She'd excused herself from the conversation with Mrs. Henderson and had quietly climbed the stairs to the second floor, her heart pounding harder with each step. The house was old, and the wooden stairs creaked slightly under her weight, but the sound was masked by the music and conversation from the party below. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit, with only a small decorative lamp providing illumination. Victoria could hear the faint sounds of the party downstairs, laughter, clinking glasses, the soft background music from the string quartet. But the second floor felt isolated and separate from the celebration, almost eerily quiet in comparison. Mark's office door was closed, which struck Victoria as unusual since he typically left it open when giving tours of the house or showing off his professional achievements to guests. More troubling, she could hear voices coming from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, not the clear, casual conversation she might have expected if someone was simply resting or making a phone call, but something quieter, more intimate, more secretive. Victoria had approached the guest bedroom door with growing trepidation, each step feeling like it required enormous effort. The door was not quite fully closed, leaving a gap of perhaps an inch that allowed a thin line of warm light from the bedside lamp to spill into the hallway. As she got closer, she could distinguish the voices more clearly, Mark's familiar low murmur, and Rachel's breathy, barely audible responses. What she heard in those few seconds before she retreated changed everything she thought she knew about her marriage and her closest friendship. This wasn't a casual conversation between friends, or even an intimate conversation between people who were crossing lines for the first time. The tone was familiar, comfortable, laden with a sexual tension and emotional intimacy that spoke of an ongoing relationship rather than a moment of weakness or a first-time transgression. The words themselves were less important than the tone, the easy familiarity, the obvious comfort they had with each other in this intimate setting. Victoria realized with horrifying clarity that she was witnessing something that had been happening for a long time, something that had developed into a full relationship behind her back. Victoria had stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing and what it meant for her marriage, her friendship, and her entire life. Part of her wanted to burst through the door and confront them immediately, to scream and rage and demand explanations for this ultimate betrayal. Part of her wanted to run downstairs and throw all the guests out of her house, to end the party immediately and deal with the devastating revelation in private. Part of her wanted to simply leave, to walk out the front door and never come back, to disappear from this life that had suddenly revealed itself to be built on lies and deception. Instead, she'd done something that surprised even her. She'd quietly retreated from the door and returned to the party, slipping back into her role as gracious hostess as if nothing had happened. She'd served dessert with steady hands, smiled at guests' compliments about the wonderful evening, and thanked everyone for helping them celebrate their marriage. The performance had required every ounce of self-control Victoria possessed, but she'd somehow managed to maintain her composure for the remainder of the evening. She'd chatted with guests about their careers and their families, had accepted compliments about her dress and her home, and had played the part of the happy, grateful wife celebrating 8 years of marital bliss. When Rachel had reappeared 25 minutes later, her hair slightly mussed and her lipstick completely gone, Victoria had embraced her warmly and thanked her for being such an incredible friend and co-hostess. Rachel had smiled brilliantly and claimed she'd been helping Mark find some old photo albums to show to some relatives who'd been asking about their wedding pictures. "You know how Mark is with his filing system," Rachel had laughed, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "It took forever to find the right box, but we finally located those pictures from your honeymoon in Tuscany that his aunt wanted to see." The lie had been smooth and practiced, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested Rachel had plenty of experience deceiving Victoria. Mark had emerged a few minutes after Rachel, looking relaxed and confident, his tie slightly loosened but otherwise perfectly composed. He'd wrapped his arms around Victoria from behind and kissed her neck, telling her what a perfect evening she'd orchestrated and how lucky he was to be married to such a thoughtful, loving woman. "Thank you for organizing such a beautiful celebration," he'd murmured against her ear, his breath warm and familiar. 8 years, and you still take my breath away. Here's to many, many more." The words that should have filled Victoria with joy instead felt like poison in her ears. How could he hold her and speak of love and commitment when he'd just been with another woman, her best friend in their own home, during their anniversary party, while their family and friends celebrated downstairs? That night, after the last guest had departed and they'd finished loading the dishwasher and storing the leftover food, Victoria had watched her husband carefully. There was no guilt in his demeanor, no awkwardness or shame. He'd been affectionate and helpful, commenting on which guests had seemed to have the best time and suggesting they should host parties more often. "Rachel was incredible tonight," Mark had said as he wrapped the leftover anniversary cake. "She really went above and beyond to make sure everything ran smoothly. We're lucky to have such a good friend." The casual praise of his lover delivered to his wife had been almost more than Victoria could bear, but she'd managed to nod and agree that Rachel was indeed wonderful. This wasn't the behavior of a man who'd just made a terrible mistake. This was the behavior of a man who was comfortable with his deception, someone who'd been living a double life for so long that the lies came as naturally as breathing. The realization that her marriage was built on systematic deception had been devastating, but what came next was even worse. Over the following days and weeks, Victoria had begun to notice things she'd previously overlooked or explained away. Rachel's frequent visits to their house when Victoria was at work late, Mark's extended lunch hours that he claimed were business meetings, phone calls that ended abruptly when Victoria entered the room, credit card charges for expensive restaurants and hotels that Mark explained as business expenses or client meetings. Most damning of all were the small intimacies she began to recognize in retrospect, the way Rachel's hand would linger on Mark's shoulder when she laughed at his jokes, the inside references they shared, the comfortable familiarity in their interactions that went far beyond ordinary friendship. Victoria realized with growing horror that the affair had been happening right in front of her for months, possibly years. She'd been completely oblivious, trusting both of them so completely that she'd never questioned their behavior or looked for signs of deception. But Rachel's biggest mistake wasn't sleeping with my husband. It was underestimating how far I'd go to protect what was mine. Most women in Victoria's position might have confronted the betrayers immediately, demanding explanations and apologies and ultimatums. Others might have filed for divorce the next week, taking whatever settlement they could get, and trying to move on with their dignity intact. Victoria had chosen a different path entirely, one that would require years of patience, but would ultimately deliver a justice more complete and devastating than any immediate confrontation could achieve. The day after their anniversary party, Victoria had begun what would become a 5-year campaign of careful observation, meticulous documentation, and strategic planning. She'd started by consulting with divorce attorneys, learning exactly what evidence would be required to ensure a favorable settlement, and what steps she needed to take to protect her assets. Her first attorney, Robert Harrison from Harrison & Associates, had been direct about the realities of divorce proceedings in Illinois. Adultery isn't the automatic game changer that people think it will be, he'd explained during their confidential consultation. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, which means the court is primarily concerned with equitable distribution of assets, rather than assigning blame for the marriage's failure. Victoria had leaned forward in her chair, absorbing every word. So the affair doesn't matter legally? It can matter, but only in specific circumstances, Harrison had clarified. If you can prove that marital assets were used to fund the affair, expensive gifts, hotel rooms, vacations, things like that, then you can argue for reimbursement. If you can demonstrate that the affair impacted the marital finances or that there was financial misconduct, that's where you'll have real leverage. Armed with this knowledge, Victoria had begun quietly documenting every financial transaction, every unexplained absence, every lie that Mark told. She'd opened her own checking account at a different bank, slowly transferring small amounts of money that wouldn't be noticed. She'd started keeping copies of all important financial documents in a safety deposit box that Mark didn't know about. More importantly, she'd hired a private investigator named David Chen, a former Chicago police detective who'd built a successful practice documenting extramarital affairs for divorce proceedings. David's fee was substantial, but Victoria had considered it an investment in her future financial security and personal justice. Most people wait until they're emotionally ready to end their marriage before they start gathering evidence, David had explained during their first meeting at his downtown office. By then, they're rushing, making mistakes, and missing important opportunities. You're being smart by taking your time and doing this properly. David had been in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of patient, methodical demeanor that Victoria had found reassuring. His office walls were lined with certificates and commendations from his police career, and his desk was organized with military precision. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" David had asked, his pen poised over a legal pad. "I want comprehensive documentation of their relationship," Victoria had replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want to know how long this has been going on, how often they meet, where they go, how much money is being spent. I want evidence that will hold up in court and ensure that I get what I'm entitled to in a divorce settlement. And how long are you prepared to let this investigation continue?" Victoria had considered the question carefully. "As long as it takes to build an airtight case. I'm not in a hurry. I'd rather be thorough than fast." Over the next 5 years, David had provided Victoria with a comprehensive record of Mark and Rachel's relationship. Hotel receipts from downtown Chicago hotels where they'd meet for afternoon trysts. Restaurant charges for expensive lunches and dinners at places Mark had never taken Victoria. Photographs of them together in compromising situations, holding hands while walking through Lincoln Park, kissing in the parking lot of Rachel's apartment building, embracing outside a boutique hotel in Milwaukee where they'd spent a weekend together while Victoria had been visiting her parents. The investigation had also revealed the financial scope of Mark's betrayal. He'd been using their joint credit cards and their business account to fund expensive gifts for Rachel, jewelry from Tiffany, designer handbags, even a weekend trip to New York that he'd disguised as a business conference. The total amount was staggering, over $40,000 of marital assets spent on his mistress over the course of 3 years. Even more damaging was the evidence of Mark's professional misconduct that David had uncovered. Mark had been manipulating client accounts to hide his personal spending, taking unauthorized loans that he'd eventually repaid, and falsifying business expenses on his tax returns. His affair with Rachel had been funded not just by stealing from his marriage, but by stealing from his clients and committing tax fraud. "This goes way beyond adultery," David had told Victoria during one of their quarterly review meetings. "Your husband has been committing serious financial crimes. The IRS and the state licensing board are going to be very interested in this evidence." The investigation had also revealed uncomfortable truths about Rachel's character and behavior. Far from being the loyal friend and victim of her first husband's gambling addiction, Rachel had a pattern of pursuing unavailable men and using her apparent vulnerability to manipulate them into compromising their other relationships. David's research had uncovered evidence that Rachel was simultaneously involved with at least 2 other married men during her relationship with Mark, including her direct supervisor at Morrison Creative, a man named Michael Davidson who was married with 2 young children. Rachel had been using her position at the company to facilitate these relationships, booking fake business trips and charging personal expenses to company accounts. "She's not just cheating with your husband," David had explained, showing Victoria photographs and financial records that painted a disturbing picture of Rachel's behavior. "She's got a whole system going, multiple relationships, complex lies, financial manipulation. This is someone who's made deception into an art form." The revelation that Victoria had been not just betrayed but completely deceived about Rachel's true character had been almost as devastating as discovering the original affair. The woman she'd trusted as a sister, whom she'd comforted through her divorce, whom she'd welcomed into her home and her marriage, that woman had never really existed. In her place was someone calculating, manipulative, and utterly without conscience. During these 5 years of investigation and documentation, Victoria had also been building her own independence and success. She'd earned 3 promotions at Sterling & Associates, eventually becoming Vice President of Strategic Development. Her annual salary had grown from $65,000 to over $120,000, and she'd been featured in several industry publications as one of Chicago's most innovative marketing executives. She'd also been carefully building her own financial independence, opening investment accounts and retirement funds that Mark didn't know about. She'd used her bonuses and salary increases to create a nest egg that would ensure her security, regardless of what happened in the divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, she'd continued playing the role of loving wife and devoted friend with an Oscar-worthy performance. She'd organized surprise birthday parties for both Mark and Rachel, had been Rachel's date to various work events when Rachel was between her other relationships, and had enthusiastically supported Mark's business expansion plans, even as she documented every instance of his financial misconduct. She'd hosted dinner parties where Mark and Rachel had flirted shamelessly while Victoria served their food and poured their wine. She'd listened to Rachel complain about her dating life, offering sympathy and advice while knowing that Rachel was simultaneously involved with multiple married men. She'd comforted Mark during stressful periods at work, massaging his shoulders and bringing him coffee while he used their joint accounts to pay for hotel rooms where he met his mistress. The psychological toll of maintaining this deception for 5 years had been enormous. Victoria had developed chronic insomnia, often lying awake at night replaying conversations and analyzing behavior for signs she'd missed. She'd begun having panic attacks during quiet moments at work, sudden overwhelming waves of anxiety that left her shaking and nauseous. She'd started seeing Dr. Sarah Chen for what she'd claimed was work-related stress, never revealing the true source of her psychological distress. The weekly therapy sessions had helped her maintain her sanity and her performance, giving her a safe space to process her emotions without revealing her true situation. "I feel like I'm living 2 completely different lives," Victoria had told Dr. Chen during one session, speaking more truthfully than the therapist could have known. "There's this version of me that everyone sees, successful, happy, surrounded by people who love me. And then there's this other version that lives with constant anxiety and feels like she can't trust anyone or anything." Dr. Chen had recommended stress management techniques, meditation, and work-life balance strategies, none of which addressed the real issue, but all of which helped Victoria maintain her emotional equilibrium during the most difficult period of her life. What had sustained Victoria through these difficult years was her absolute certainty that she was building towards something important and necessary. Every lie she swallowed, every betrayal she witnessed in silence, every moment of emotional agony she endured, all of it was an investment in ultimate justice. She'd found strength in gradually understanding that Mark and Rachel's relationship wasn't the passionate love affair they probably believed it to be, but rather a mutual parasitic arrangement between 2 selfish, dishonest people. Mark got the excitement of an affair and the ego boost of maintaining 2 relationships simultaneously. Rachel got financial support, professional connections, and the thrill of stealing someone else's husband. Neither of them was capable of genuine love or loyalty, which meant their relationship was ultimately as hollow and doomed as their individual characters. Victoria was simply going to help that inevitable collapse happen on her timeline and under her terms. The final phase of Victoria's plan had begun 6 months earlier, when she'd finally decided the time had come to reveal her hand. She'd quietly filed for divorce, presenting her attorney with 5 years' worth of evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic betrayal and financial fraud. her attorney, now Robert Harrison from her original consultation years earlier, had been stunned by the thoroughness of her documentation. In 32 years of family law, he'd told her, his voice filled with professional admiration, "I've never seen a case this meticulously prepared. You haven't just built a case for adultery, you've built cases for fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and professional misconduct. This is going to be a landmark settlement." But Victoria's plan extended far beyond securing a favorable divorce settlement. She'd also compiled comprehensive evidence of Rachel's professional misconduct and personal deceptions, evidence that would destroy not just Rachel's career, but her marriage and her financial security. The evidence against Rachel included documentation of her affairs with multiple married men, her misuse of company resources to facilitate these relationships, her manipulation of client accounts, and her pattern of deception that extended back years before her involvement with Mark. Victoria had also discovered that Rachel's second marriage to Dr. Thomas Wright, a successful cardiac surgeon, was based on lies that went far deeper than just her affair with Mark. Rachel had hidden substantial debts from her previous marriage, had misrepresented her employment history, and had even lied about her age, claiming to be 3 years younger than she actually was. Through David's investigative network, Victoria had learned that Dr. Wright was himself facing scrutiny from the medical board due to concerns about his judgment in both professional and personal matters. The evidence of his wife's systematic deception and infidelity would likely accelerate any professional consequences he might face. For Mark, the consequences would be even more severe and far-reaching. Victoria's evidence of his financial misconduct would result not only in the loss of his accounting practice, but in potential criminal charges for embezzlement, tax fraud, and professional misconduct. His CPA license would be revoked, his business partnerships would be dissolved, and he would likely face years of litigation from former clients seeking restitution for his financial mismanagement. The beauty of waiting so long, Victoria had explained to Dr. Chen during their final session, is that both of them built their entire adult lives around lies and deception. Mark expanded his business, took on partners, hired employees, bought expensive equipment, all while engaged in fraudulent financial practices. Rachel remarried, got promoted, bought a house with her new husband, established herself as a respected professional, all while maintaining multiple affairs and engaging in systematic deception. The interconnected nature of their deceptions meant that when Victoria finally pulled the thread, everything would unravel simultaneously and catastrophically. Mark's business collapse would expose Rachel's affair to her husband and her employer. Rachel's professional downfall would implicate her various lovers and potentially expose other financial irregularities. The criminal charges against both of them would become public record, destroying their reputations permanently and ensuring they could never rebuild their lives in Chicago. 2 weeks earlier, Victoria had set her plan in motion with military precision. She'd served Mark with divorce papers at his office during the morning staff meeting, ensuring that his business partners and employees witnessed the service of documents that detailed not only his adultery, but his financial crimes and professional misconduct. The papers had included a comprehensive asset freeze, preventing Mark from transferring or hiding any marital property, as well as a temporary restraining order that prohibited him from contacting Victoria except through their attorneys. Rachel had been served with multiple legal documents simultaneously, a lawsuit for alienation of affection backed by 5 years of photographic and financial evidence, a complaint to her professional licensing board detailing her misconduct and ethics violations, and a comprehensive report delivered to her husband documenting her multiple affairs and financial deceptions. The results had been swift, devastating, and completely aligned with Victoria's carefully planned timeline. Mark's business partners had called an emergency meeting within hours of receiving the legal papers and had voted unanimously to dissolve the practice pending investigation of the fraud allegations. Several major clients had withdrawn their accounts immediately upon learning of the charges. The state licensing board had begun formal proceedings to revoke Mark's CPA credentials, and the IRS had opened an investigation into his tax practices. The district attorney's office had been contacted by several of Mark's former clients and was considering criminal charges related to the mismanagement of their accounts. Rachel's situation had collapsed with equal speed and thoroughness. Her husband, Dr. Wright, had filed for divorce the same day he received Victoria's evidence package, immediately freezing their joint accounts and moving out of their shared home. Her employer, Morrison Creative, had placed her on administrative leave pending their own investigation into her professional conduct and misuse of company resources. Rachel's affair with her supervisor, Michael Davidson, had been reported to Morrison's board of directors, resulting in Davidson's immediate termination and a comprehensive audit of all accounts both he and Rachel had managed. The company was now facing potential lawsuits from clients who had been affected by the mismanagement and conflicts of interest. I could have destroyed them 5 years ago, Victoria had reflected during her session with Dr. Chen, but it wouldn't have been nearly as complete or as permanent. They needed time to build lives and careers worth destroying. They needed to accumulate assets worth losing, reputations worth ruining, relationships worth ending. They needed to feel secure and successful and untouchable. That made the fall so much more devastating and so much more educationally valuable. As Victoria had prepared to leave Dr. Chen's office for what she knew would be the final time, she'd felt a sense of completion and justice that had eluded her for 5 long years. The weight of maintaining her deception, of swallowing lies and pretending ignorance, of watching her marriage and friendship be systematically betrayed, all of that was finally lifted from her shoulders. For 5 years I've lived with the knowledge of their betrayal, she'd told Dr. Chen. Every single day Mark would come home and kiss me hello after spending his lunch hour with Rachel. Every single week Rachel would text me about girls' night or weekend plans while she was actually coordinating her secret schedule with my husband. They made me complicit in my own humiliation, and they thought they were so much smarter than me. She'd paused, her expression hardening with the memory of years of accumulated pain and rage. They thought I was just the naive, trusting wife who would never question her husband's word or suspect her best friend's loyalty. They thought I was someone who could be lied to indefinitely without consequences. They fundamentally underestimated who I am and what I'm capable of, and that was the mistake that destroyed them both. The transformation was complete. The trusting, accommodating woman who had discovered her husband and best friend's affair 5 years earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, more strategic, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might consider betraying her trust. Victoria's phone had buzzed as she left the therapist's office, showing a text from her attorney. Mark's CPA license suspended indefinitely. Rachel terminated with cause, no severance. Dr. Wright filing for divorce with adultery clause. Criminal charges likely within 30 days. District attorney wants to meet next week. Congratulations, this is the most comprehensive case I've ever seen. Victoria had smiled as she read the message, then deleted it and put her phone away. Justice, she'd learned, was not something that happened to you. It was something you created through careful planning, patient execution, and the courage to see difficult decisions through to their ultimate conclusion. Tomorrow would begin the next chapter of her life, one built on truth instead of lies, on strength instead of naivety, and on relationships that had been tested and proven rather than assumed and taken for granted. Mark and Rachel had taught her valuable lessons about the nature of deception, betrayal, and the consequences of misplaced trust. Now she had taught them an even more valuable lesson about justice, patience, and the fatal mistake of underestimating someone whose trust and love you had violated. The student had become the master, and the game was finally, definitively, and completely over.